Are there main differences between men and women fasting, either daily, intermittent, or longer ones that people should be mindful of?
Well, in general, you know, women are a lot tougher than men, so they're a lot easier to work with. Uh, our tolerances as males, I think, is somewhat less to certain types of
Sure.
discomfort. But women are also have a completely different physiology when you think about it. Healthy women will maintain 25% more fat than men would on average. Women have significant numbers of complicated systems that men don't, have to deal with. Weight loss for women is slower than males. Women are full of estrogen, which is a fat storage hormone. Men are full of testosterone, which is a fat burning hormone. So you definitely have differences between men and women, and most of uh, it's quicker and faster and easier in males than it is in females. It seems like women always have to work harder at pretty much everything to get the same kind of results. So we tell them to get used to it because there's nothing we can do to change that. I think that it was really necessary for women. When you think about women of any species, including humans, they're essentially energy conserving fat storage devices. They had to be able to store fat in order to survive a period of biological vulnerability called pregnancy, which, by the way, men don't even, have any relationship to biologically. And so that necessity makes them more efficient at storing fat. So that when it comes to losing fat, the female brain is not saying, "Oh, good on you, girl, let's get rid of this fat." No, it's saying the opposite. You store as much fat as you can for as long as you can, because then if you get pregnant, you have a better chance of survival. Your body's designed to conserve energy and to store fat. And essentially, biologically, women that stored fat well were the winners. The people that could eat whatever they wanted and never gain weight, they weren't the winners. The winners were the ones that took that long boat ride and they survived. They probably ate everybody else for all we know. But the bottom line is, if you store fat easily, that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing biologically. And in a natural setting, you and your ancestors were the survivors. In the modern world, you're screwed. Because with ultra processed food, the question is only, how fat are you going to get? Because if you're eating those foods and your body has good plumbing, which by definition, if you gain fat easily, you got good plumbing, you're going to get proportionally more fat. But you need to not see gaining fat easily as a bad thing. It's not. It's a good thing. It just means you have to change your environment.
Why is having fat not great physiologically?
Well,
In
having fat is
excess.
critical and necessary.
Yeah, the
Having
excess.
too much fat is a problem. And what happens is, getting fat is so valuable that healthy people will store fat to survive the inevitable scarcity that would naturally be present. But storing too much fat leads to a formation of a type of tissue called visceral fat. Visceral fat is pro-inflammatory. It's hypermetabolic. It acts, as I said, like a tumor. And
This is
so
the fat around the
it
organs.
generally accumulates around the organs in the belly. That fat there functions differently than your normal adipose
How
tissue
so?
because it produces inflammatory products.
Okay.
Now, why does it do that? Probably because it shouldn't be there. This is aberrant tissue. The body was not designed for an environment where dietary excess would be routine. It almost never, like, for example, even if you go back to when we were kids, or at least when I was kids, typical classroom, you had one or two overweight children. Sometimes they were made fun of. Now there's one or two kids that are not overweight. Okay, we've gone through this big change. In fact, 1986, I always think a significant thing was we introduced high fructose corn syrup, and then we started subsidizing it, making it cheap, and the soda pop, and you think about it, used to be like a 9-ounce Coke was a special treat, right? And now you got the big gulp with free refills, and it's like we've completely turned ourselves on end, and as a consequence, we're getting excess tissue, and that excess fat just happened to have this inflammatory process, and it leads to diabetes, heart disease, autoimmune disease, cancer, which is what we're suffering from. And if you look at the fatter people are, the higher their risk of dying from those diseases. If you go to countries where a percentage of body fat is lower, the disease rate is much lower until they get more wealthy and begin to adopt our dietary habits, and then the disease rate escalates. And now we're seeing it worldwide. We're seeing it in China, you see it in India, you see it in all the places that begin to adopt our hyper-processed foods to get our consequence of hyper-processed foods diseases.
So, could you expand on what is the unique link between visceral fat and certain types of cancer and how fasting is an efficacious intervention for those?
Well, visceral fat is associated with an inflammatory response. It's associated with cancer. It may not be the only factor, but I'll give you an example. Like even during the pandemic, where we had the highest death rates around, which it's kind of curious if you think medical care is going to help protect you. The reason is that we also have the highest percent body fat. And the fatter you are, the higher your risk of dying from infectious disease, including COVID-19 infections and all the rest of it. You didn't hear much of that because that would be blaming the victim, and it's not politically correct to acknowledge that being overweight might actually have some health consequences. But it does, not the least of which is being vulnerable to dying from infectious disease, as well as these other diseases that we've been discussing. And fasting, much like it does with other types of tumors, preferentially breaks them down. And so you'll see lots of masses and growth that go down with fasting disproportionate to the percentage of body fat that's lost. So in my mind, visceral fat is like any other tumor in the body, and fasting happens to be good at giving the body a chance to get rid of the things that ails it.
Hmm. So, if fasting is an incredible intervention for these more chronic illnesses and diseases, I'm curious, how much do you feel like, or potentially all, of chronic disease could be tracked back to what we put in our mouth and how much of it?
Well, I think there's three things that are really important. Number one is diet. Number two is sleep. And number three is exercise and activity. Our ancestors that couldn't just sit around and, get fat because they got hot, they got cold, they got thirsty, hungry, and they didn't want to get eaten. And people that didn't move didn't make it. Okay. Now in the modern world, post-industrial world, we can sit around. In fact, men in our society I understand, don't even exercise anymore. They hire other people to do it for them. It's called the NFL. And so they sit around in overstuffed chairs drinking high caloric beverages, watching other people engage in mock warfare, pretending to be part of the winning coalition.
When it comes to the hyper palatable foods and the excess of salt, oil, and sugar that hijack our system and make us feel like we need more food than we actually nutritionally do need. Talk about the importance of examining that and how we can guard ourselves from not falling prey to those.
It's not fundamentally different than any addiction. If some people can drink alcohol and not become a drunk, but if you're a drunk, it's not you. And some people can eat bits of this and that without becoming overweight, but if you're overweight, it's not you. It's not like you haven't tried to regulate it. You can't regulate it. And so the answer is don't take the chemicals that fool your brain. And so ideally, if you're eating an exclusively whole plant food diet, right? So it's fruits, vegetables, grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds, and you're not eating animal foods, the meat, fish, fowl, eggs, dairy products, oil, salt, and sugar. We know what happens because we've got thousands of patients that we've worked with. If you're a male, you can expect to lose about 3 pounds a week with moderate activity down to optimum weight. If you're a female, only about 2 pounds a week down to optimum weight. So women will lose about 50% less weight, everything else being equal, just because of the differences between men and women. The problems that are associated with diatretics begin to reverse. Now, they don't reverse quite as quickly as they do in fasting. Things that may take a couple weeks of fasting, it might take you weeks or months of feeding, but the process continues, and it continues to unwind. One of the benefits of fasting is we can get people sometimes out of pain so they can get back to being active, and they can, they're not depressed anymore, so now they're willing to take action. But the fundamental healing is diet, sleep, exercise. That's why not only is it necessary to heal, but in order to maintain it, you have to maintain it. Radicus means radical root or cause, right? Radicus. So you have to deal with the root or cause of the problem. And that's not what medicine is doing. Medicine is helping alleviate the pain without actually forcing you to actually deal with the issue. And that's why it doesn't work very well for so many of these chronic degenerative things. Interesting, in women, for example, women have problems men don't even know anything about, but fibrocystic breast disease, dysmenorrhea, menorrhagia, polycystic ovarian syndrome, uterine fibroid tumors. There's like a whole industry of diseases that women get. And there's one thing that seems to be kind of associated with all of them. And that's that if estradiol, the active estrogen hormone, doesn't get broken down to estriol and excreted in the urine, the estradiol builds up, and it seems to be associated with a lot of these problems. Well, what breaks estradiol down to estriol is the bacteria that live in the gut and the liver function. So it may be the reason women get so much benefit after fasting with their fibrocystic breast and the dysmenorrhea and all this stuff, maybe because of the effect on the hormone balance that's occurring because of their relationship with these organisms. And fasting's like rebooting a computer. You know how your computer doesn't work and then you get frustrated, you turn it off, and you don't know why, but when you turn it back on, it's working again because you flash the memory, whatever it is that's going on. It's the analogy is it's similar in people. When you shut it down with fasting and you turn it back on, not only does it feel sometimes better, even during fasting, like you experienced as your serotonin and dopamine levels are modulated, but the entire system of balance seems to be rebooted. And that may be why even a short fast, like a few days or even a week, can sometimes have a profound effect on especially relatively healthy people that, don't have to have a wholesale renovation, but just need a little bit of fine tuning.